Hello, Physionic dedicated podcast. I've got a really interesting topic for today. Of course, most of the topics that I end up choosing, well, I choose them because they are interesting, but this one is, I like to use the term mind-blowing pretty often, so that is essentially how I'm going to describe this one. This one is truly mind-blowing. To introduce myself, Nicholas Verhoeven, if you're not familiar with who I am, I'm a PhD student in molecular medicine. And with that introduction out of the way, let's jump into this week's Physionic podcast. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about a Nature paper. I seem to be covering a lot of different Nature papers of late, which is quite the undertaking, but they are incredibly interesting. They're not published in Nature, one of the biggest journals in the world, for no reason. They tend to be high quality work. So anyways, this Nature paper discusses how in embryogenesis, so essentially when we are formed, humans are formed in the womb or before that process of growth, there is an incredibly competitive system that occurs between our cells. So it's like, think of like a gladiator fight that's happening between your cells. It's the version of you that came out of the womb is quite literally the best version of you. The reason for that is because the best cells, it's like survival of the fittest, is so cool to read about this. It's essentially survival of the fittest of your cells. So the aggressive cells, the most aggressive, the high proliferative, meaning high growth cells, tend to bully the lower growing cells. So certain cells are going to do worse than other cells. And they bully these cells, these slower growing cells, by literal contact, just by contact inhibition, to a point where they just outgrow them, and or they can induce apoptosis, meaning that the weaker cells will then be given signals to essentially commit suicide, to end themselves. And or a third mechanism is by pushing these weaker cells up to the surface. So being in closer contact. So what they studied were specifically skin cells, which makes a lot of sense. So they push the weaker cells to the very surface of the skin so that those cells will die off sooner. They're kind of like this, like, hey, why don't you walk out into the haunted house before I do? Essentially, that kind of mentality. And they kind of bully them. It's like they have a gun and they're bullying these cells. Okay, you go in there first, otherwise I'll kill you. So they throw them into the surface structure of the skin, and then of course, as we're moving around, we're doing things, a bunch of damage occurs, and those cells end up dying off because, well, they can't handle the environment. And of course, then we go through a whole recycling process and whatnot. But this discovery is so cool that there's a competitive mechanism between cells by which our cells essentially select for the strongest, best versions of themselves. And that is what you're born with. You're born with the strongest, best cells of yourself being a representation of you. So if you were to go back in time, go into the very beginning and kill off some of those competitive cells, you would likely come out as a worse version of yourself. So the version that came out is the best, presumably, if this mechanism works as well as it does, presumably the best version of yourself. How cool is that? How cool is that to think about? And of course, I mean, you can continue to improve from there, but that's more of a conscious thing as opposed to before you're born. It's like this unconscious, just this biological frenzy that's going on to create this organism, you, that is viable, not just viable, but strong and functioning, and just doesn't have many, health issues and whatever. I mean, even if you do have certain health issues, the odds of that, of your cells working as hard as they do just to create the version of you that you are today, which is largely intact, is absolutely astounding. So mind-blowing, as I said earlier. So I thought I'd share that with you. Let me know your thoughts. Of course, I'll link the study so you can check it out yourself. And that's what I have for you. Hopefully you found it as mind-blowing, as astounding as I did, because it's this kind of stuff. It's really this kind of stuff that really gets me geeking out about cellular biology and medicine and things of that nature. All right, that's what I've got for you. Hopefully I'll have the pleasure of speaking with you in the next one. Have a good one, guys. See ya.